You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 487 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, Will Porter returns to talk about some of the news stories he's been covering over at RT in the past week. That's where Will Porter is a staff writer. He also has bylines at consortiumnews.com, antiwar.com, and the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find this show, some of the articles that me and Will have written together, and a whole bunch of stuff that we have independently published. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be back. How you doing, Kyle?
I'm good. It's I think as we were talking about before we hit the record here, the weeks kind of go by quick for whatever reason. I don't know if there's just like so much going on as far as like news feeds go that fills your day. Although a lot of it isn't things that I'm, as interested in as much as, I think me and you both keep up with the coronavirus as it is a part of kind of our job to know what's going on there. And it does, for me, impact what's going on in U.S. foreign policy and everything like that. At the same time, I'm not like, really into viruses, and it's not a particular interest of mine. And so while there is all this news, at the same time, it's not the news I'm necessarily looking for. So in one way, the weeks are going by really quick. But in another, I feel like we're really hurting on getting some very important information. So hopefully me and you could get out some of the stuff that is likely being skipped over all over the mainstream media today, Will.
Yeah, all right, let's do it.
All right, so the first thing I have up here is a very interesting article that I saw in Defense One. I sent it over to you, Will, and it talks about this Iran memo, I believe published by the Air Force, saying that it looks like the sanctions that the U.S. has on Iran is hurting the country's ability to respond to coronavirus. So tell us some of the details about this.
Yeah. So as you said, there was this leaked Air Force intelligence brief that I think the nation had actually initially gotten a hold of, and it got picked up in a bunch of places. And it kind of has two like key aspects to it. And the first part comes back to something that we've been covering a lot on the show lately, and it's sort of the effects of the virus on the U.S. military and how that might impact their operations and stuff. And so the memo says that Qatar has the highest number of coronavirus cases out of any country in the Middle East that is housing U.S. troops. And it's saying that the bulk of those cases are coming from Iran. And it's suggesting that this could turn into a threat to American soldiers or the civilian personnel stationed in Qatar. And, we've talked a lot about how in these far-flung places, you kind of, you're not really equipped to deal that with an outbreak very well, with a bad outbreak. And so it seems that is also the concern in this leaked memos. They're like worried that this might, eventually affect our personnel out there. And so that's kind of the first thing, saying that people are carrying the virus, they're carrying it from Iran into Qatar. And so the second aspect, though, is, as you said, it mentions the humanitarian impact of the U.S. sanctions. And so the memo is saying that Iran's economy is, quote, crippled and in a, quote, chokehold, and that the U.S. sanctions are, quote, have left Iran bereft of financial resources to mount an effective public health response to the coronavirus and, quote, unable to order ventilators from abroad. And so this briefing effectively is warning that the American sanctions are harming Iran's ability to contain the virus, which is now spilling over into places where U.S. troops are stationed. So that's kind of the gist of this whole memo. And, we've talked before about how the sanctions on Iran prevent it from doing transactions with foreign businesses and governments and stuff, entities in other countries. And so if the Iranian government or companies in Iran want to buy a bunch of test kits or masks or ventilators, that money has to go through this network of financial institutions and banks and stuff to make those transactions. And so our sanctions target those choke points and stop Iran from doing overseas business with, companies and banks and even NGOs. And so that's what this memo is kind of hitting on. It's saying that they can't buy things from abroad. And these entities can apply for exemptions, but it's this long and complicated process where you need specialized lawyers. And it can become very costly very quickly when you're dealing with like a small company or a small NGO who Iran might be wanting to buy masks or test kits from or something, some small lab overseas. And then there's a lot of cases, too, where there's companies and banks that are actually allowed to, they're permitted to do trade with Iran, but they don't, just because they're afraid of, the way they're afraid of punishment from the U.S., even though they're technically allowed to. And so this puts up all kinds of obstacles in front of Iran's ability to get the supplies and aid and stuff that it needs. So contrary to what U.S. officials are always saying, because technically the sanctions don't directly target like medicines and stuff like that. But this is sort of like a loophole. It's like a less blatant way of inflicting, serious pain on Iran. And you end up with pretty much the same result if you were outright blocking, humanitarian aid. And so despite the fact that the administration does not seem willing to budge at all on its maximum pressure campaign, they've kept this up all along, even while Iran's had this bad coronavirus outbreak. I think they have the worst outbreak in the whole Middle East. But with this intelligence report, I guess we're seeing now that like there's some parts of the military that are starting to take like a similar stance as the UN and a bunch of other humanitarian groups on the effects of the sanctions. You've had all kinds of you had those 24 former diplomats come out, retired heads of NATO. I think even Madeleine Albright has come out and called out the sanctions on Iran during the coronavirus outbreak. And so now it does seem the military is sort of joining them. And it seems, too, it's not just, anti-war people like us talking about the sanctions now. This is sort of making its way into the mainstream. That list of people and organizations I just gave, those are pretty establishment figures. And now even the U.S. military, or at least some part of the U.S. military, apparently is calling attention to this, this issue, the sanctions on Iran.
So I have one thing to add and then one follow-up question. What I had to add was just on top of all the, U.S. sanctions part of it, the U.S. government part, there's also different like neocon organizations that will go around, and Eli Clifton has done some good work on this, and they will send emails to companies saying that, hey, if you continue to do business with Iran, you're doing business with terrorist groups. This is problematic, as anything that happens in Iran, I'm sure it's very possible that somebody in the IRGC is eventually either going to use it or be involved with it. And they've been labeled by the U.S. government as a terrorist organization. And so now, even if you are just a pharmaceutical company or a company that makes masks, what ends up happening is if you're 3M, you sell the mask to Iran, and then some, IRGC guy is standing, guard somewhere with a rifle wearing a mask. And you're going to get slaughtered by these neocon groups in the press, and so they bully people out of sending some of these supplies as well, on top of everything else to do with the sanctions and how all that pressure is put in place. But the follow up I had was, do we have any idea of how this memo got leaked or why it was leaked? I know you said it went to the Nation first.
I'm not totally sure. I think the Nation had just said the way they cited it was just like according to a leaked intelligence briefing obtained by the Nation. So I'm not really sure the circumstances under which it leaked. But I mean, it is just interesting, I think, to even see that I think it's probably there may be somebody in the Air Force or in the military who's particularly concerned about this, who would hand it to the press. And so that's interesting to see that there's an individual like that. But on the institutional level, it's interesting just to see that they're even putting together these kind of intelligence briefs, warning about like the human. They weren't being too like lovey-dovey about it. They weren't being too big of like humanitarians. They're just saying that, hey, that this could be affecting our troop presence in Qatar. But nonetheless, they are, sounding some kind of alarm about the effects of the sanctions. So I found interesting.
Yeah, I just asked because I'm sure whoever leaked it, well, I shouldn't say that because who knows what the person was thinking, but it seems like a pretty obvious consequence of leaking this is that one of the stories is going to be the U.S. should lift sanctions, and even though our own military says it's hurting the civilian population, and that's a fairly strong kind of source to use for the people like maybe an Ilan Omar who's in the camp of trying to at least get the sanctions temporarily lifted. And an obvious consequence of lifting the sanctions, I think, is a possibility or a potential to improve relations between the U.S. and Iran and start to walk back Trump's maximum pressure campaign and reestablish some kind of not insanely hawkish foreign policy. Just go back to like the normal level of hawkish foreign policy the U.S. has against Iran. That's very possible. The U.S. starts lifting sanctions, and so I just wonder if that could have been an ulterior motive here. But I guess we're still just left to speculate, as we don't know how this memo gets leaked.
Right, exactly. That is kind of unfortunate. I wish they did get into that.
So the next story I have, Will, is about the South China Sea. And one of the things I try to update on the show whenever I see a story, and even if it's just to say it happened, is when the U.S. sails warships either in the South China Sea or through the Taiwan Strait as provocative movers maneuvers, excuse me, as far as against China and their territorial claims to the South China Sea. So, can you give us a little bit more detail of what's going on right now in the South China Sea, other than just that, hey, the U.S. ships are there acting provocatively?
Yeah, so in this last week, and actually in the last month or so, there's been a lot of activity in the South China Sea. And so the U.S. military is kind of always doing what they call like freedom of navigation missions and patrols with warships and bombers and stuff in that region. But this week, it really seems to have ramped up. And so early last week, you had a guided missile destroyer, the USS Barry, making a few trips through the Taiwan Strait, which kind of connects the East and South China Seas. And China, of course, considers Taiwan to be its own territory and a province of China proper. And I'm not here to like endorse that claim or anything, but just to provide the context that we're sailing a warship through territory that China considers its own. And so in both of these sail-throughs of the Taiwan Strait last week, a Chinese aircraft carrier was kind of like looming in the distance, like following us around. And so that kind of, it's a little worrying when you see like a huge warship like that and a U.S. destroyer kind of standing off there in the strait. But this same destroyer, the USS Barry, eventually ended up getting close to what China calls the Xisha Islands. And they're also called the Paracel Islands, and they have a few other names too. They're actually disputed territory. Like some of these island chains out there in the South China Sea are claimed by other countries. The Xishas are claimed by Vietnam, who actually fought a war with China in the 1970s over the same little island chain. But because the U.S. destroyer got really close to this island chain, the Chinese scrambled some warplanes and brought out some the naval assets and stuff to escort our destroyer away. And it complied. It didn't make a stink about it. And so that kind of, that stuff does tend to happen. It kind of blew over. But on Thursday, you also had a pair of B-1B Lancer heavy bombers do this flyover and what they call a show of force mission over the South China Sea, where they did this 32-hour round trip from a base in South Dakota. But that, though, was just sort of a prelude for the next day. We actually deployed 4 B-1s, the same kind of B-1B Lancer heavy bombers, deployed 4 of those to the Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. And so pretty much every single day last week, something happened out there in the South China Sea, like between sailing through the strait, between sailing near these disputed islands, doing the flyover show of force thing, and now deploying B-1 bombers there. Pretty much every day you had some kind of activity out in this region. And we actually just pulled out all 5 of our B-52 Stratofortress bombers from that same base in Guam in April. And those have actually been in rotation, a constant rotation for 16 years straight. And so it was kind of an abrupt decision to suddenly recall our B-52s from Guam. But now I guess we see that we were just swapping them out. And the B-1 bombers actually can carry bigger payloads, I think like 20,000 pounds more. And so they can carry more and heavier weapons than the B-52s. And so I guess that kind of explains the sudden withdrawal of the B-52s, because they were just swapping them out for the B-1s. And the Air Force actually didn't say how long the B-1 deployment would last, because recently they stopped doing their typical 6-month rotations. With when they pulled the B-52s out, they actually stopped that like long practice. And I think they had said in a statement they're trying to be less predictable or something. And so I think that's like part of what they're doing here is like they're trying to adjust some of their strategy and predictability and stuff. And so overall, it was a pretty active week for not only the Air Force, but the Navy as well in this region near China there. We can only imagine how the U.S. would be responding if China were doing maneuvers like this in like the Gulf of Mexico or something. So it's, useful to try to imagine the comparison. But most of this stuff does seem fairly routine. Like the deployment is a little bit out of the ordinary, but like the sail throughs and the flyovers and stuff, that's not totally, out of the norm. But it is worth pointing out that this is all happening at a time when the president, Trump, is escalating his rhetoric against China. He's sort of blaming them more and more for the coronavirus outbreak. And so there very well could be some more hostile intent between these recent maneuvers and deployments and stuff than there normally would be when it's sort of routine, just because like it does seem the U.S. is sort of heating up its rhetoric against China right now.
Right. And at a time where, travel is limited and everybody's trying to do kind of the opposite of what the U.S. military is doing here by deploying troops to far off places, sailing warships more than they need to, and just generally spending a lot of money. It sounds like all this stuff is incredibly expensive. And I think it just goes probably and points to the view that the establishment and the leaders of this country have that we are at war with China. And, that's kind of absurd. That's not the case. And as I think we talked about in the episode about Captain Brett Cozier, kind of what the situation was and the difference in understanding of the people on the ground on the water there. They know that they're not at war with China and that we didn't need to deploy those bombers to Guam or what China is going to take over South Korea or Japan or Taiwan. That's not really the threat here. And so it seems absurd that we're doing this. And if that's the threat, is that something that the U.S. is willing to go to nuclear war over? Taiwan or Hong Kong or Korea or the South China Sea? I guess that's kind of the question I have here, Will. Is the Trump administration and the military coming out and kind of trying to explain why they feel the need to carry out all these kind of drills and stuff? And couldn't that money and resources, be better spent right now just about in any other way?
Yeah, I mean, certainly to your latter question, yes, of course, like these some of these resources could be spent in a better way. I mean, like, even if you think about just like the fuel and stuff, the cost of even just like doing that flyover mission with the B-52s, so like how many, American yearly salaries does that cost to just arrange that? But in terms of the administration's like willingness to sort of like push this, or the military explaining why they're adopting a more hostile approach, I mean, they're just sort of they're if you read their statements, I think Stratcom is actually the one who announced the new B1 deployment. They're just using the same boilerplate language about like deterrence and freedom of navigation and all that kind of like just rhetoric about having to contain China and stuff. However, as we've covered on this show quite a bit, the Trump administration's sort of like overall strategic posture, it wanted to adjust itself to more like great power competition and away from counterterrorism missions in the Middle East and stuff. And we've seen a little bit of that, but I think now they might actually be trying to like kick that into higher gear. It seems like an odd time to decide to like embark on your grand strategy during this major health crisis, global health crisis. But yeah, it does seem like they're maybe trying to adopt a little more of that great power competition strategy that the Trump administration's been going after.
Right. Well, it is one of those things here where maybe we could get a lot more coverage on this if everybody wasn't hyper focused on Corona right now. That's why I understand why some people, especially those who think Trump is an idiot, hear him talk about disinfectants and injecting them and think that Trump is telling people to go drink bleach. And it made sense to me that, some blogger at MSNBC is going to write an article about it. But, the focus of everyone on it is so, destructive and negative because it means that nobody is talking about this, which is far more important and a far bigger scandal. And, I think does more to show how questionable Trump's leadership is than, him not, just kind of rambling like Trump does and talking about things kind of in an offhand way that maybe he even knows is going to get the left-wing media worked up and make way too big about a deal about it and then look like bigger fools than Trump himself.
Right, yeah, it's unfortunate. They're kind of going after this low-hanging fruit stuff about, yeah, like you said, injecting or like, using UV as a disinfectant and all this stuff. Yeah, like they're going after that low-hanging fruit when there's really good reasons to slam this president. There's all kinds of stuff that show his what they're always saying, his recklessness and irresponsibility as the commander-in-chief and stuff. But they're just giving him free reign there.
Yeah. So the next story we have here, Will, is Germany bans Hezbollah. And I guess maybe people who kind of just think of this as a militant group or a terrorist group are curious about why Germany would just now be banning Hezbollah. And then I think for those of us who understand that it's a political as well as a military organization now, and it is essentially just, the army of southern Lebanon, and it would be not exactly equivalent to Germany banning American soldiers, but certainly Germany maybe banning Russians from ever entering the country or something like that. So tell us here a little bit about what's going on with Germany banning Hezbollah from its borders.
Yeah. So late last week, as you said, Germany prohibited Hezbollah, the Lebanese political party and militia, and they officially labeled it a terrorist organization. And you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but previously in Germany, they had made this distinction between Hezbollah's political and armed wings. And the armed part was banned in Germany, and the political organizations and charities and community groups that Hezbollah ran and, sort of groups linked to Hezbollah were allowed to exist there. But now, since last week, they've now abolished that distinction, and the whole group is prohibited. And according to German media, I was actually reading that it's now illegal to express any kind of public support for Hezbollah. Like, you can't display one of their flags at a gathering, for example. And if you have assets that are linked to Hezbollah, they can be seized. And so like this has some pretty like serious legal teeth, like this banning of Hezbollah. It's not just in name only. There's a lot of actual consequences to this. And with the banning, they also they announced the group was banned and carried out a bunch of police raids on people they said were extremist members of Hezbollah. And then they raided mosques in 5 different cities in Germany as part of this whole operation. It's kind of weird, though, because the German government, German security services, apparently only think there's like 1,000 or 1,100 of these guys active in the entire country. So that doesn't seem like a very big number to be making such a big deal out of it. But there has been this push to make Hezbollah illegal in Germany for like years now by some of the more right-wing parties, and even Germany's Green Party has called for their banning. Some people in Germany's Green Party. I don't know if the party itself has. But like last year, for example, I wrote an article about how the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, they're pretty like hardline nationalist right-wing party. They introduced a bill trying to ban this group, saying that they're a terrorist organization, that they're an enemy of Israel, and that kind of stuff. And so there's definitely some precedent for this decision that the Germans took. And in last year, you also even had Richard Grenell, who at the time was the ambassador to Germany, but is now the acting director of national intelligence. He actually published an op-ed in a German newspaper, I think in German, the German language, calling for Hezbollah to be banned. So like there's also been some American pressure on Berlin to ban this group. And just in case people aren't aware, some people might not really know what Hezbollah is or like the context why this is important. I'll just explain that like they were created in the 1980s during Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, and sort of that's how they cut their teeth, is fighting the Israelis. And they fought on and off with them since then and had a few major conflicts. In 2005, they had like a pretty major exchange. And generally, though, they've been successful in keeping the Israelis out of Lebanon. And so that's sort of like their role and why they've risen to prominence in that country. And they've also become very close allies with Iran, who's sort of like their main benefactor and supporter. And so that's why some people don't like them as well, is because they're not friends with Israel and they are friends with Iran. So you can kind of see, if you're aware of some of the factions out there politically, you might guess who's for and against them. And of course, the Iranians, being sort of a close ally to them, they've already come out and condemned Germany's decision to ban them on the day that it happened. I think the foreign ministry came out and said, like, how dare you ban this group, which has a lot of charities and like, regular civil organizations that aren't, militarized. And as you said, they are not just a militia. They've had, they've been a part of a bunch of governing coalitions in Lebanon. So they're like a big and important part of that country's political system and their whole political landscape or whatever. And they often do hold a good chunk of seats in the Lebanese parliament. And so they're not just like some dodgy terrorist group. They are a political party, like proper. And they also have a bunch of branches and organizations outside of Lebanon, like the ones that they have in Germany, for example. But a lot of other countries have also passed laws to either prohibit outright or restrict their activities. And so in the US and Canada and the UK, the EU, and of course in Israel, they've sort of been restricted. And so for Germany to do this, it's not totally unheard of, but it does sort of go against, like, in the EU as a whole, only the armed wing is banned across the EU, at least according to like the European Union level law. But Germany has now decided to go a little bit further and ban the group entirely, including their like charities and civil organizations and stuff. Right.
Well, the next story we have here, Will, is about Michael Flynn. And this is something that we've covered on the show since the early episodes that we were doing together. And that's the whole Russiagate saga and what Michael Flynn went down on. So I know we don't have time to review the whole thing, but just give us, kind of the relevant facts on why everybody's writing stories now about the FBI doing maybe some questionable things in the questioning of Mike Flynn.
Yeah. So last week we had these FBI documents, like emails and handwritten notes. I think ended up being like 6 or 10 or something pages of documents across 2 days. But these were unsealed by a court and published. And they show that the FBI, apparently they seem to show that the FBI was really looking to entrap Michael Flynn during the whole Trump-Russia investigation. And of course, Michael Flynn was, for those who might remember, was for a very brief time Trump's national security advisor. His first one, actually. He's had like 5 since. But in one of these messages between FBI agents, one of them straight up just says that their goal in interviewing Michael Flynn was to, quote, get him to lie so we can prosecute him or get him fired. So that kind of suggests that they had intended to catch him in what they call a perjury trap from the very beginning. And so that's kind of like the major revelation of this document, is that they're clearly looking to entrap Flynn. And then there was another batch of documents that came out, I think on Thursday, showing that the FBI decided that there had been, quote, no derogatory information on Flynn, and that they were going to stop investigating him. But apparently Peter Strzok, who was one of these top agents investigating on the Russiagate case, and he was later caught up in like leaked messages where, being very biased against Trump and saying we have to stop him at all costs and all this stuff. And so this Peter Strzok guy apparently stepped in and convinced the other agents to keep it going, and the probe into Flynn going, saying that like the top FBI officials were now involved. He said people on floor 7, or the 7th floor, I think they call it. That's like what they use to refer to FBI leadership. And so he kind of got the other agents to continue this probe into Flynn, and they ultimately did set up an interview with him. And for whatever reason, he agreed to do that without any legal representation present, so he had no lawyer there. And then they did ultimately they got him for lying to the FBI, exactly as they seemed to have set out to do. And so apparently they were right about to pull the plug on the Flynn investigation, but Strzok kept it going, and it ultimately allowed them to get what they wanted, to get him to, to quote unquote lie on record. And for those who don't remember, Flynn was investigated as part of the whole Russiagate thing back in 2017 for this conversation he had with the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Sergei Kislyak. And at the time, Flynn was a top official in the incoming administration, but it had yet to take power. But nonetheless, Trump had won the election. And so he wasn't just some random guy talking with the Russian ambassador. He was the national security advisor. But nonetheless, he's been painted as like he was doing, as if he were doing secret backroom dealings and conspiring with the foreign power and all this stuff. But anyway, I just think these documents just show, like, yet again, it's just another example of how this whole Russiagate story, there's so much corruption behind the investigation, behind the Mueller probe and Crossfire Hurricane and all that. And so much has come out proving that it's all kind of a sham. There's the way George Papadopoulos was seemingly lured into his dealings with Joseph Mifsud, the way the FBI lied about the Steele dossier to get the FISA warrant on Carter Page to spy on him. And now here we have them setting out to entrap Michael Flynn. This is just like the tip of the iceberg. There's so much that went on. Flynn's own story has all kinds of twists and turns with like his first defense team. It was handled by this corporate law firm that has all these former Obama officials. I don't know why he hired these people, but that's become like a huge wrinkle in his case where now he's trying to get his whole case overturned and dismissed. He's trying to revoke his guilty plea because he's saying that his first defense team had sabotaged him and that now he's pointing to the FBI and corrupt stuff like this, like these documents, saying that like the Obama administration was corrupt to even investigate him in the first place and they were trying to entrap him. And so that's kind of where things are with Flynn right now. He's trying to get this whole thing dismissed because it's been such a fiasco.
Right. Well, the only part of that story I want to add to is just that call with the Russian ambassador Kislyak. The one thing that Flynn asked for was that Russia do something on behalf of Israel, veto a resolution condemning settlements that Obama wasn't going to, and Russia declined to do that anyways. But it just goes to show how absurd it is that the Russiagate has been the conspiracy all along. They would have far more evidence of an Israel gate if that's the path they wanted to go down. Not that they're necessarily, I'm not trying to imply that there's some like grand Jewish conspiracy or anything for all those people out there. But I'm just saying that there's more evidence and, stuff to show that at least that was a little bit nefarious as compared to anything that, going on with Russia here.
Right. Like that conversation he had, I think like the thing they tried to damn him for, the thing they tried to pin on him was I think they mentioned briefly like some of the sanctions the Obama administration had levied. And he had kind of said like, don't worry about that. We'll hammer that all out when we take power in the administration. And so the FBI was talking about trying to hit him with the Logan Act, which is like this like old law from the 1700s that no one's ever been successfully charged with. Which is like it's supposed to prohibit people from doing like private negotiations with foreign governments. But that's ridiculous because Flynn was the national security advisor. He was not a private citizen trying to negotiate sanctions. It was kind of just like a boilerplate like, oh, yeah, don't worry about that. We'll get that hammered out as far as I understand. And so that whole thing is like really a tempest in a teapot that they made out of that like little chunk of the conversation.
Absolutely. So the last thing I have here is something that we've been talking about the past couple of weeks, and that is what the hell is going on with Kim Jong-un? Where is Kim Jong-un? Why isn't Kim Jong-un apparently in front of a camera all the time? I could see how some Americans are confused with how much FaceTime our president gets. But I don't think it's as uncommon for Kim Jong-un to be like kind of off screen for a couple of weeks. But, there were rumors surrounding his death and some reports that there may be some credibility to it. And we had talked about in the possibilities, but it at least appears, Will, that this guy is alive. So give us a little bit of a breakdown of your take. Is the video authentic? And what do you think? Kim Jong-un alive or dead?
Yeah. So last Friday, despite all these rumors of Kim being dead or brain dead or in a vegetative state or whatever people said he has the coronavirus, there's all kinds of things. He finally popped up after like 3 weeks in North Korean state media doing this ribbon cutting ceremony at this big new fertilizer plant in I think the city's called Suncheon. It's like 30 miles north of the capital city of Pyongyang. And at first, there were just reports saying this happened in sort of the KCNA, the Korean Central, state media. But eventually, you had photos and even a video come out of this event. So it does seem, at least seems, he's alive. However, some people have like speculated that this footage is old and that it's not really from last week. But I kind of have no reason to believe that. I don't think that this is from, because like he actually visited the same fertilizer plant that while they were still building it back in January. And if you look at some of those older images from that visit then and you compare them to the recent ones, it does, if you look really closely, you can see they've painted a bunch of structures and buildings. Some of the roadways that appeared to be dirt before, they seem to have been paved. And there's a couple other differences and stuff. And so I tend to think that I can say pretty confidently that these new images are not from that previous trip. They're not like the old one. I guess they could have arranged some other trip there to do it, but I don't know. I just tend to think if they were going to fake that, they would have done it when he was there last, and the images are different. And so I tend to, I'm pretty skeptical about like the claims that they're old images. Some people have said that there was a body double there or something, but I guess they would have to have a really good body double because it looks like Kim Jong-un in those photos and in the video. It seems to be him. I don't know. Maybe he has some doppelganger out there and, we couldn't tell, but I don't know. To me, by all indications, he is alive. But one other interesting thing about this fertilizer plant that I've seen popping up in some of the press, like you'd think this might be kind of a mundane thing. You might wonder why Kim keeps visiting this place. Like, first of all, it's a huge facility. If you see like the videos and the photos and stuff, it seems clear why the North Koreans would want to tout this as some big industrial achievement and success, because it's a huge facility. But apparently some of these media reports are also saying that it has a dual use potential. And they're saying that it could be used in North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And so I, of course, don't understand like the actual science behind any of this stuff. But I've been reading that some of the equipment there apparently can be used to extract uranium to produce yellow cake. But then I was also reading a little further into it. And as far as I understand, they also have all kinds of they have other advanced and more efficient ways of getting uranium. And they do it openly. And so it wouldn't really make sense for them to build this huge sprawling facility to use a less sophisticated method and just to kind of keep it hidden when they're doing it openly anyway. And, North Korea also needs fertilizer. They're, like to grow food. They've had all kinds of shortages of fertilizer. And last year had their worst harvest that they've had in a decade. And so, I don't know. I tend to doubt some of the claims that they're using it for uranium. I can't say for sure. Maybe they will try to boost their, uranium production or something with it. But it seems like they're more likely using it for fertilizer. But yeah, so there's been all kinds of speculation because of that alleged dual use potential. That he's trying to send some message or some threat to the world by reappearing at this fertilizer plant. But I just tend to think the message that they're trying to send is like the one, like the obvious one, that hey, look what we can do. We can build these big, industrial achievements and stuff. So that's what I tend to think. That was the purpose of the reemergence there. But by all indications, though, he is not dead. It seems that he, there's a lot of room to speculate why he might have disappeared for 3 weeks like that. He's done it before. It's not the first time he's kind of like gone off the radar for a while. But right now, I don't think anyone has any solid evidence one way or another about why he disappeared. But it seems like he's alive.
Right. One thing I had just watching the video, I was trying to get a sense of. He didn't seem to like undergo any major physical changes as far as like weight gain or loss or different hair. He didn't appear to like be like sweating profusely or look in any way ill or unaware of his surroundings. I mean, it's hard to tell from the video that you have. I'm not trying to say that, the man's in perfect health, but it doesn't appear that he had major heart surgery 3 weeks ago or anything like that. And I believe that's what the South Korean media is reporting now, that he didn't undergo heart surgery. I am, maybe skeptical. Maybe he did have a mild case of coronavirus or something like that. And, with the rhetoric of the North Korean government so far, which has been coronavirus doesn't exist in North Korea, maybe it was kind of hard for him to make a public appearance and keep up that narrative or something like that. So I do think there are a lot of different possibilities. And again, I think it's also possible to look at, this is a way to Kim generated quite a bit of media attention, for his country, which has been largely blacked out. There's been, a lot of talk about the suffering of the Korean people and the structure of the Korean government. And so I guess in some way that's not what Kim wants the international community talking about, but at the same time, at least there has been conversation about North Korea, and that could help to, bring it up in the mind of Trump and get some work done. So I don't know, a lot of possibilities. Do you have any answers or any more insights onto what his absence could possibly mean?
Yeah, I would just point out that like it was kind of interesting to see in the video. You can see that there are people there, like, because there was a big crowd of people there to watch the ceremony, the ribbon cutting thing, and you can see them wearing surgical masks and stuff. So that was kind of interesting. Like, I wondered if they would even show that, because they're, like you said, claiming there is no coronavirus in North Korea. So it was interesting to see them wearing masks. But one point that Michael Malice had pointed out of like why he might have disappeared, or like specifically why he didn't appear at. Because the big thing that kicked off all the rumors is that he was not present at the ceremony to celebrate, I think, the birthday of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. And Michael Malice, who has like done a lot of work on North Korea, he made a good point that, like, with all these thousands of people gathered in Kim Il-sung Square with the coronavirus going around, like, it kind of makes sense why Kim wouldn't want to be there. Like that's kind of risking it. And so I don't know, it might just be that maybe they're just he's trying to not contract this illness, despite their claims that it's not even in their country.
Right, he understands that if he's on a ventilator for a couple weeks, it could cause a lot of instability. So better make sure that doesn't happen. Well, thanks for coming back on the show, Will. It's great to have you on here every night to talk about all the great things you're writing over at RT. Tell people where to find it, because unfortunately you don't actually get your own bylines there, and so people gotta go to your social medias to get the great work that you're putting out there.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on again. I appreciate it. I always like coming on and do these Monday shows. And yeah, if people want to find what I'm writing, you can find me at Twitter. My Twitter handle is @WKPANCAP, ANCAP. I'm on Facebook as Will Porter. I share all my work there. And then also, as Kyle said at the beginning of the show, you can find other writing of mine at consortiumnews.com, at antiwar.com, and thelibertarianinstitute.org, which is where you can find this show.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle.